welcoming Professor Helen Kelly-Holmes.
Okay, so thank you so much, Jaffer, for this lovely introduction. Really meant a lot to me. Thank you very much. Thank you, Donna, for your wonderful land acknowledgement, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to talk. And I would also like to thank the organisers on my own and on your behalf for a really wonderful conference, a fantastic standard of papers. I've heard comments like, you know, the generosity of the time that's been allowed for the papers, the amount of discussion, the grouping of the papers, and the really kind of laid back but highly efficient and friendly organisation. So I'd just like to thank them very much. I don't want to name anybody because I'll probably forget them, but can I thank you all very, very much. Yeah. And I hope you have a good rest after this. Okay, I'm just going to keep an eye on my time here. So you might have been a bit puzzled by my topic. You know, I mean, management is very firmly inscribed in the language policy canon, you know, the body of knowledge. And I'm just citing here the late Bernard Szpolski, and in many publications, and he's not the only one, he has shown that, you know, language has this tripartite, language policy has this tripartite model. And that language management is central to all of this. We have a whole school of language management studies. We've had many papers at this conference where language management has been central. So why am I concerned? It's not an endangered subject within our field. I suppose from my work over the last few years on I suppose what I'm calling language policy 4.0 and multilingualism and digitization. It seems to me that the challenges we're facing in trying to understand that really demand a stronger integration and renewal of interest in the management function. And Peter Ives spoke about this in his paper the other day as well. I think we're very similar ideas around this. So in this paper, I want to talk first of all about why, for people working in my area, things like media and language policy. So as language policy has developed, we've maybe kind of fallen out of love a bit with language management. Now, I'm not arguing that we should fall back in love with it. I think it's very bad to be in love with concepts, and there was maybe a bit too much love for management in the beginning. So I want to chart maybe how that's happened as language policy has developed. Then I want to look at how move away from the field, first of all, and look at how language policy within digitization has actually evolved, you know, what's actually been happening there. And then why that makes it really important to bring back management, and maybe share some ideas around how that might happen. So first of all, I think one of the reasons we've perhaps fallen out of love with it is that it was very management heavy. The origins of language policy and planning were very management heavy. Liddicoat and Taylor each have a very nice overview where they look at agency in language policy theory in the field. And they start with, you know, they're using, as we've all used many times, Tom Riscento's great 3-era framework. And they talk about the colonial era. And I'm really grateful to both Tommaso and Amal for setting the scene for this, because they talked about the colonial logics that inform our thinking, the coloniality of knowledge, and this is a prime example. So this is the empiricist, technicist era of language policy and planning. So no surprises, the actors in the management were almost exclusively governmental and their institutional agents, and people were passive objects of language policy. Agency just involved a delegation of responsibility to micro-level agents, to micro-level actors. And we, you know, it was conceived of as ideologically neutral, you know, that actors are essentially experts, technocrats, and it wasn't given too much critical attention. So the key question, of course, was what, you know, and we have these descriptive studies and evaluations. So what is happening and what should happen in language policy? And again, you know, Tom's model is really good in respect to this. So I would argue that we have, as a result of this, and we can discuss it afterwards, a kind of an enduring legacy of the idea of states as being the key and perhaps the only macro level actors in relation to the management of language policy and language planning. And I would argue that we need to rethink that in the current era. What also happened is, of course, that language policy and planning doesn't exist on its own. It's integrated into all other fields like applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, and lots happening there as well. So, of course, we start to recognise greater agency in what Liddicoat and Taylor each call the post-colonial era, Tom's second era. Changing concepts of agency and the who of LPP, and a move from a focus on experts who fix problems. And I really so I'm going to talk a little bit about AI. I'm very interested in AI. So I like sometimes to surrender to the technology and let AI take over. So this is their concept of management. So that's quite interesting. This is the image that they propose for management. We realize, of course, language policy and planning is not ideologically neutral. We don't have these problems that can easily be solved. And also recognition that the focus on management left little space for examining practices and beliefs, and there was a desire to redress this. So we have an analytical turn where we look at the how more than the what, and perhaps then onto the why. Third era, we always have 3 eras. Liddicoat and Taylor each talk about the postmodern era. Again, Thomas called it the postmodern era. Also, critical ethnographic term, many other terms for this kind of change. The idea, Alistair Pennycook has said, moving from a segregationist view of language policy and planning to an integrationist view. And the integrationist view should unite the macro, the meso, and the micro, but I'm not sure it has. And maybe that's, again, something that we can discuss. And perhaps these have kind of parted ways a little bit. More focus on local actors, enactments, lived language policy, more focus on behaviours and practices as evidence of policy. And I think also the post-structuralist turn in language has also affected how we do language policy and planning. So the idea of macro-level management is much more compatible with the structuralist view of language. It's a thing, you know what it is, you recognise it, you can manage it. Much harder to do this with concepts of translanguaging. How do you talk to macro-level agents if you have a model of translanguaging? That's hard, much harder to do than say language X has X number of speakers, you need to support it. So I think this has also affected us. Okay, so then moving on to digitization or digitalization, I don't really mind which one we use. And so what do I mean here? So for me, this is a technological move which has had huge consequences for language, for society, for everything. So it's a switch basically from analog to digital communication. And everything that has happened since, all of the things that keep updating and changing, have been about the drive for ever increasing efficiency. The interesting thing is that since the kind of switch from analog to digital, we've actually had much more multilingualism. So initially there was, this is going to kill multilingualism. That actually hasn't happened. We have much more multilingualism. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Interesting, I think, the models of language that are involved in the ideologies of language that are involved in the setup of this. So there's a very, the Shannon and Weaver encoding, decoding model is the basis for digitization. I think the ideologies of I don't know if there's anyone here who works in the space, but, the ideologies of people involved in programming, the language that they use, they're trying to kind of decolonize it a little bit at the moment as well. Some of it is very unfortunate and has very kind of strange ideas about language and about people and that sort of thing. So the ideologies of the people involved in setting up the technology are very important. So we already had one-to-many communication, this monologic communication with analog communication, but now you have the possibility initially of much wider communication, potentially limitless. Geographical area becomes less relevant, but also crucially enabling dialogic and peer-to-peer and almost polylogic communication. These have been the revolutionary things, really. So for me, it's about the communication and the connectedness that have resulted from these developments. First of all, the physical infrastructure of the internet, the content in terms of the World Wide Web, and they're mainstreaming into all aspects of our life. So the hardware and the software, from social media to wearable devices to electric cars, all of these things are digitization. They're enabled by the digital technology and they impact us in the same way. And they increasingly have started to manage us. So a friend of mine got an electric car, and I was talking about it this kind of topic, and she was saying, yeah, she said, I've never felt less autonomous since I bought an electric car. It's managing me, you know, and initially she resisted it, and then she started to like it, and now she doesn't even notice it. So it's quite interesting how this is happening. So I'll go through these, but just to give you an overview of kind of how this has developed and how the kind of language management has developed. So we had a very early era of monolingualism when language just wasn't really talked about. This is the early web, designed for a very small speech community, and they were talking to each other, you know. Countries very heavily involved in this, a certain number of small countries, military actors, various things involved in this. Language then becomes a problem, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm using RUS's much used and abused framework, but it works quite well here. This is sort of the web, early days of the web, the kind of the 1990s to the 2000s. Gives up as the technology changes again, language is right, starts to emerge. We have kind of partial multilingualism that starts to grow, the technology changes. And what we have now is we have all of these things still, but primarily we have language as resource mentality and ideology, I think, which underlines and is the basis of the political economy of the technology that we currently have. So I think it's really important to go back to the founding of the web. And there was really a complete absence or erasure of any consideration of language, apart from programming languages, and a lot of the programming languages were based on English as well. This had two reasons, really. First of all, the nature of the speech community that founded the web, and also the ideology behind the internet and the web. So if we look at the nature of the speech community that set up the web, it was created for a group of English speakers, English native speakers, so the US very involved in this, but also English as a lingua franca speakers, because obviously the work in CERN involved many people from all over the world, but, you know, they wanted to get this job done, you know, so let's not bother with any nonsense like that. Let's just talk to each other and get this job done. So they needed to communicate with each other. And as I said, it was a peer-to-peer type communication. And Wayne Colco writes about this very nicely. There was a very nice special issue of the New Review of Media and Hypermedia in 2005 addressing this. And, you know, they already were saying, you know, that the way in which this was set up, it was developed in Western society. It wasn't designed explicitly for use in isolated peripheral cultures. And these cultures didn't participate in its inception or current design. So it was a relatively small group of people involved in this thing, which has taken over our lives completely. So we need to remember that. So for instance, the encoding to facilitate the whole process, the digital communication, was based on ASCII, which of course is based on the Latin alphabet, the Roman alphabet, and on English. So what you had then, of course, you did have a language policy. You had a very powerful language policy of de facto monolingualism, common sense monolingualism. We've heard many examples of that over the last few days. More than that, however, there was an ideology behind the web. And I think, again, the image that AI has suggested for me here is an interesting one. So it was deliberately designed to be non-hierarchical, and that you would have parity between all the parts, between all the links and the nodes. So there was to be no center, no overall authority. And of course, you need an authority in order to regulate this space and to impose things like language policies or to promote multilingualism. And yeah, Bakel, a nice article here says, you know, there's a contradiction between a global internet that comprises a single language, a common standard that facilitates connectivity in a seamless manner, and an internet that facilitates multilingualism and so is different everywhere. So there was this ideological resistance to any kind of top-down management or central control. More than that, though, and this is a quote from Tim Berners-Lee, who's, you know, the father of the web, is, you know, it's not even, it's more than that. It's kind of an idea of universalism, monolingualism as equality. So he's saying here, the dream behind the web is of a common information space in which we communicate by sharing information. Its universality is essential. The fact that a hypertext can point to anything, be it personal, local or global, be it draft or highly polished. Sorry, this isn't some strange time era in the future. That's 2009, it should read. When we're all long gone, the robots have taken over. So that's really interesting, you know, and that's, again, a really powerful language ideology. It's the ideology of universality, and you have an explicit commitment to not have linguistic diversity, and that's the idea that that's equality. You know, if we have this striving for singularity, as Pennycook has called it, Monica Heller has talked about the uniformization, you know, so, and, you know, we can see parallels in many of the papers that we've had here, and we have nation states doing this as well. So it certainly wasn't an ideology-free space, if anything ever is. So language does become a problem, however, because the speech community grew and diversified. The web developed from its original usage. So this idea of this universal space, all of a sudden it starts to get carved up. And the web has been, I suppose, what's happened more and more is this differentiation, more and more spaces, more and more different types of functions. You get diversity, and you know, everything has been challenging this idea of not having hierarchies, because if you don't have hierarchies, if you don't have certain things becoming more prominent, you can't actually do business on the web. So you need to have hierarchies of content. So the speech community grows and diversifies as the web developed, and the language then becomes a problem, and you have to think about how to diversify linguistically. At this point in time, countries were key agents, and more countries started to enter the space. Didn't want to be left behind, working with the tech industry and looking at technopolitical solutions, such as the stabilization of non-ASCII scripts, Unicode, things like that. Really good account by John in 2013 of Hebrew, and just really kind of gives a very good account of the time, government's involvement, and also the you know, again, the colonial logic behind even something like Unicode, which was intended to diversify and create multilingualism. I was thinking of Tommaso's paper yesterday, and he points out the kind of again, these nation state and colonial logics. Lingua territorial management, so these top level domains like .ca, .ie for us started to develop. So it's interesting, you know, you have this universal space, but I want my country, you know, it needs a space. And the idea as well was almost that you'd have one country, one language kind of type domains and top level domains. So strong territoriality principle. Crucially, corporate actors start to enter, and e-commerce, you know, if you're my age, you'll remember, you know, it was very niche for a long time. Nobody interacted with the web and did e-commerce. It was very early days. And I mean, you know, not wanting to promote Jeff Bezos, but if you know, read about him or anything like that, his, you know, how he started his business is just so kind of amazing, you know, and what it has become. So this, you know, just kind of shows how the technology has changed, this speeding up and efficiency making. So interestingly, corporate actors have driven a lot of the multilingualism on the web. So countries are doing it, but these are big countries doing it for big languages generally. And what you can see is, for instance, Arabic was quite late to the game and was quite late to develop because it didn't have a recognizable, I suppose, sort of mother country in the sense. So the languages with the big mother countries, big languages with big countries associated with them, got in much quicker and started to get involved and to make sure they weren't left behind. Growing linguistic diversity. So even Rachel was talking yesterday about French. So, you know, French already had a fair representation, not really sure what that means, in the 1990s. But the early 2000s, 2003 was kind of a turning point in the multilingual development. Internationalized domain names became possible, scripts started to stabilize, and diversification and growth of the speech community. And native speakers of English started to be overtaken by non-native speakers. And 2003 is the first year this was charted. This has to be really taken with a pinch of salt, because the internet world statistics are extrapolating from top level domains and users in top level domains to language usage. So they're pretty crude. It's not, certain other users do count content. So, we had a paper earlier talking about Wikipedia and their use, and they do count kind of content. But this was really just, you're using the internet in this top level domain, so you must speak this language. And okay, so that's so many speakers of Spanish, etc. So many speakers of whatever. What you had then was growth of already big languages and a kind of a partial multilingualism, and very much in an ideology of parallel monolingualism. So here's the French version, here's the Spanish version, here's the whatever version, yeah? And very much this idea of counting languages, providing languages, top-down provisioned languages, and counting speakers. So this is trying to solve problems in this way. And a lot of the ideologies are very familiar to us. But then the technology changed and we had Web 2. So we have the participatory web, and this means people can actually create content. And this, again, has been a huge change. So previously, countries asked, you know, where's our language? We've got to get this. We've got to get present. We've got to get lots of content up on the web. We don't want to be left behind. So this was previously asked and solved by countries. Kind of became a question of where is my language? Okay, so moving from a kind of a country, territory, national language level to, hang on, all of a sudden we can create content, we can provide language, scripts have become stabilized. So it becomes an individualization of language problems. So from a kind of a nation state view of language problems in relation to digitization, it becomes an individual one. And you can solve your language problem yourself, okay? So you have the tools now to solve your language problem because you can create content. So quite a noticeable switch from territorial rights to kind of individual user or consumer rights in terms of language problems. The gift economy takes over. So Shields' really excellent book here on gifting, and it being the basis of much of what happens in digital technology is, you know, so currently I'm gifting my data to the Fitbit, you know, here it's probably recording my heart rate, which is not very good. So we're gifting all of the time. So when we use the technology, there's conscious gifting and there's unconscious gifting. So unconscious gifting is just, you know, I'm on my phone, I'm searching on the web and it's learning things about me, my language choices, my language behaviors, my language usage. So this is the unconscious gifting, and this is really substantial and significant. But there's also conscious gifting, and conscious gifting is when we actively do things. Linguistic citizenship you were talking about yesterday, there's a lot of this linguistic citizenship for small languages, and small languages need to no, it's okay. Small languages need to work much harder here, and a lot of the conscious gifting is done by small languages and small language speakers. So they create content. So nice example here, Aoife Lenahan's study of the Facebook translations app. So Facebook localized their app from English to big and small languages through a translations app, which people, you didn't have to be an expert. You could just volunteer your translation. And she studied the Irish language app. So quite powerful that the French localization and the Irish localization were done exactly the same way. The French one was done in 24 hours. The Irish one took many years. So, you know, because far fewer people, big stakes, a lot of language ideological brokering going on. But people are gifting their language here in a very conscious way. You know, we've seen many papers here showing that. Or a very nice paper on typographical advocacy for small languages, looking at Gorani, and really looking at how the language advocates and are working with tech providers and linguistic citizenship. You know, an English speaker doesn't need to do this, or a French speaker doesn't need to do that. The small languages need to do a lot of work. And Dan Cunliffe's work is really good on Welsh, if you're not familiar with it. And, you know, he's been in on this from the beginning and looking at natural language processing. So trying to get natural language processing in Welsh, trying to diversify the natural language processing data that is there. So this gifting, so it's happening all the time, and this is the basis of the algorithms. But some of it is conscious, and the conscious work, tends to be done by the speakers of smaller languages. So what we have now is actually there's no limit to languages. And so you have this ideology of hyperlingualism. And I'm borrowing here from Anna Powell's concept of hyperlingualism, which she uses to describe the situation within super diverse societies. But hyperlingualism it's both what we see because of the technology that's there. It's possible to offer an unlimited number of languages. We can create content. But it's also an ideology of it, and this leads to smaller and smaller and more fractured speech communities online. So having gone from this universal speech community to kind of nationally based speech communities through the top level domains to kind of more smaller and smaller, more differentiated speech communities. More and more languages achieving their own bounded space and places of use. And, my language or, our language, but not kind of at a national level. Very interestingly, you can also have internal diversity, that you can write in your own particular way. And again, we saw papers on this morning. Previously you were provided the content on the web, top-down content. Now you can create your own, and you can just create it in any language, any way of writing or speaking or whatever that you want. Decline in the language territory link of the languages problem of the era. And countries start to vacate this management. So in the current era, I think I would argue that language is very much constructed as a resource. We have almost kind of tailorized and individualized multilingualism. Not for everyone, not everywhere, very aware of the digital divide and what Daniel Cunliffe has called the content divide in languages. But we almost have ideolingualism, where I can have my own language space. I can have this mass linguistic customization. So, the way your phone learns sometimes your mistakes, your spelling mistakes, and it keeps throwing them back at you. Previously, it was very hard to write Irish names. Now that it learns the names of your friends or whatever, it's suggesting them. So we have this mass linguistic customization. What is also happening, though, is, again, and this is analogous to the filter bubble idea, is that we're shielded from a lot of actual multilingualism because our language problems are kind of solved for us. The digital context, they know our language preferences, they know our language habits, they know what we want to see, they know what we don't want to see. And so these are solved for us on an individualized basis. Language is also a key resource for artificial intelligence, multilingual computing, large language models. Language is the basis of digitization. So it's a huge resource. We've got many agents now at many levels. Individuals are agents, communities and groups are agents, companies, the tech sector, and crucially, the technology is now also an agent. And I actually think we have to start thinking about that, that the technology is agentive in this. And that's only increasing. So just to, again, this is where we've come from and this is where we are. And I suppose you can see here the speeding up and overlapping of these eras. So Web 2 was the start of kind of content. It's not that long ago at all. And then we're still gifting content, but Web 3 was more about blockchain, things like that. And Web 4 is the smart web, which solves our problems for us. But I think what we see increasingly is fractured and kind of isolated speech communities. And that's quite an interesting idea, that we're sort of protected in our own sort of individualized language bubble. Not everywhere and not, for everyone. So why do we need to bring back management? I would say we know an awful lot about micro-level management of practices and beliefs in online spaces and digital spaces. This is just a very, very brief overview of the studies that we have, and we've heard some really nice papers as well over the last few days looking at this. We've also have a long history of studies of digitization and language revitalization, language maintenance, from a starting point where it was the idea that language is going to, the web is going to kill multilingualism. We have many studies of situations where people have been able to document languages, maintain languages, and also create spaces for languages to be used. And interestingly, and I've noticed this in looking at papers recently, you know, digital contexts are being integrated into other aspects of language policy. So this nice paper recently looking at family language policy, and they were looking at the digital aspect. We've seen about digital aspects of diasporic language policy and planning. So it's not that we're ignoring digitization, not at all. It's really there. But perhaps the techno-political and economic management of those practices and the locally managed policies is something we don't know as much about, I think. And it's very complicated and it's hard to figure out, but I think we have to try. I also wonder, and we can discuss this, how we overestimated the agency of individuals and online communities in terms of what they can and can't do. Again, something to discuss. We're all being managed whenever we're using digital communication, and Peter Ives made that point the other day in his paper. And language is actually a key part of the management. The primary means of managing people online is through language and through their language behavior. So we need to look at individual and group policing and management of language policies. We're doing that. We need to look at official policies. Again, Peter was talking about that. We also need to look at covert policies. And I have here the cookies and the contract, which AI has thrown up for me in terms of regulations. So, you know, we have the actual policies which say what you can and can't do online, you know, the actual written down stuff, the terms and conditions, what we accept, what we don't accept. And then there's all the kind of behavior the covert policies, the behavior that happens every time we use technology, which we don't really, which is much more opaque and much more difficult. So how might we bring management back into the analysis of language policy and planning? So first of all, I think, and this has been something I've had to do, move beyond the kind of the treasure trove idea of language policy and planning and digitization. So it's kind of like there's so much stuff there. It's just a fantastic resource. And Christine Hine has talked about this, you know, she pioneered virtual ethnography, and she said, like, we have to kind of, you can kind of go in and find brilliant stuff, but you have to think, where did it come from? How did it get there? How did I find it? So denormalizing the spaces and the content. And again, I think that was something that Peter was talking about. And this is hard, this is really hard with students. So I teach this with students. And of course, you know, I sound like someone from the last century. I am someone from the last century, but, you know, the middle of the last century. But, you know, so trying to denormalize it is very tricky, you know, it's very difficult. Doing the boring stuff, of course, the documentary analysis, all of these things, that's really essential. So that's something that actually absolutely has to happen. Also asking, like, whose language problems are anticipated and solved and whose are not, and why. So if we find a space, well, okay, that's great, but what other spaces aren't there? Whose language problems aren't anticipated? Whose language problems aren't solved, and why? What's permitted and what isn't? Yeah, outside even of the regulations, you know, what are the actual experiences? And we will gather those data through long-term virtual ethnographies and many other things. So there's a whole multi-methods, multidisciplinary approach to trying to look at this. I personally found cybercriminology extremely insightful. Cybercriminology, they know a lot about kind of how things take off, how things work, and I've tried to integrate that into my own work. So we need other disciplines in this. So beyond the kind of official policies, we actually need to find out, how does this thing make money, right? So we're using it, we're gifting stuff to it. How does it actually make money? How does it function? What's the technological and economic basis of it? Then how's our behavior being managed? How does this serve the function? How does the management of behavior actually make money and help it to function? And how does all of that impact on the language practices that take place and on the ability of groups and individuals to police or to manage micro-level language practices and beliefs? Yeah. So in a way, I mean, we can start wherever we want, but I think we tend to focus more on the third element generally, and I've done that myself as well. And I've only recently started to think, hang on, this doesn't work for me. So it's about informing through this kind of analysis and adapting existing methods. And for me, that's meant, you know, I use virtual linguistic ethnography, which is a combination of virtual ethnography, linguistic landscapes online, and computer-mediated discourse analysis. But I've added now this kind of management dimension to it, and also, as I said, disciplinary insights from cybercriminology. And cybercriminology, they're obsessed with language. You know, they're always, language is the thing. In fact, they have a very simplified view of language, I would say. You know, certain words are trigger words, but they have very good ideas about how certain bits of information take off and other bits don't. So if I have time, I think I do, I'll show you a brief example of what I mean from Twitter. So Twitter is about, I'm going to call it Twitter. I find it very hard to call it X. Twitter is about driving action. That's how it makes money. So anything that drives action, creating and posting content, liking, retweeting, commenting, creates value. So users are directed to view or to create content based on their algorithmic identity, which is based on past behaviors. And then they're incentivized, tempted, provoked, prompted to carry out these actions, to drive action in relation to that content. This could be for their own reasons. You know, there are a lot of businesses on Twitter and this is what they do. It can also be for social capital. I'm thinking of Tommaso again, the emotional reasons why people do this, particularly in relation to language content, for the purposes of X or Twitter. So what interested me then when I was looking at kind of Twitter threads, and I'm going to show you one in a minute that I've looked at, was how the ability to drive action and to impact on practices and kind of micro level policy making depends on 4 things I've identified. So influence, alignment, expertise, and validation. And they have to do with, I came up with them by looking at how Twitter actually works, how it makes money, what it's kind of prompting us to do and provoking us to do. So I'll show you a brief example of some data and some analysis. So this is a Twitter thread about, which is a discussion very typical, and I've seen many examples in the conference of these kinds of discussions online. So this person posts, when did Irish people who said mum replace it with mom? Nobody said mom in the 90s. I'm asking because I find it fascinating. So there's so much of this kind of content. So treasure trove me is, oh, this is great. You know, I'm going to speak at a World English Conference. I thought, oh, this is brilliant. I'm going to take that. You know, so that's the treasure trove thing. Then I started to try to analyze the thread using my virtual ethnography and CMDA, and it just wouldn't work because it just didn't make sense. I tried to put it in order. I tried to work out the timings, but it didn't actually explain it to me. So then I really had to work out, you know, how does this thing actually work? And how come I see certain things and I don't see other things? How come certain things rise up, certain things don't? So I started to investigate that. So just to contextualize this, it's a debate about the correct term for mother in Irish English on Twitter and whether this comes from Irish. So there's a big discussion about this. We have language ideologies around Irish English, around contact between languages. We have practices here. We've metalinguistic discourses and we've language policing. We have it all. We have the beliefs, the ideologies, and the management. And again, it's an example, I would say, of language policing in Blomart's words. And interestingly, and I'm thinking of Hannah Luca's talk about the Yiddish mother and wonderful data there about Yiddish and gifting of Yiddish on TikTok. Pierce has a very nice study. You might think, oh, this is a one-off. No, Pierce has a very nice study about a really nasty interaction on Twitter around what you call your mother in the north of England. So people really... Nobody cares what you call your father. You know, people are very interested in what you call your mother and very invested in that discussion. Very brief overview of Irish in like 1 minute. It's complicated, like every other language situation. So Irish, I call it privileged minoritized language. It's privileged, it's the first official language. It's an official language of the EU. It also has status within Northern Ireland as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, and it's also protected by the charter that we were talking about in a couple of talks in Northern Ireland. Within the South, within the Republic, it's a compulsory subject for, or it's a subject for the compulsory period of primary and secondary schooling. That's a very simplistic view. However, it's minoritized in relation to English in everyday life and most domains. Irish is both a success and a failure of revitalisation. It really depends on what questions you're asking and what you want to find out. You can say it's actually very successful, or you can actually say it's a complete failure. Policy tensions and contradictions. So you have an acquisition policy for the general population, and you have a maintenance policy for first language speakers. First language speakers are all over Ireland, and in fact you have more first language and everyday users, speakers in Dublin and in Limerick than you have in Gaeltacht areas. However, in absolute terms, however, in terms of the percentage of people speaking it in the community, much higher in these red areas, in these Gaeltacht areas, along mainly the West Coast, but not exclusively. And of course, the Gaeltacht area, as usual, these peripheries are resources for the state, they're resources for language learning, they're resources for identity. You have, again, as in all these situations, an inferiority, superiority discourse. So Irish is wonderful. It makes us different to English people. It's cool in an era when speaking English is no big deal in the world, and it's even sexy, you know, things that it never was when I was growing up. And then you have an inferiority discourse, which is it's a waste of time. You know, let's do something useful. It's no good in the world. It has symbolic value as an identity resource. John Edwards and others have written about this, many people have, but it does have instrumental value. You know, it's needed for educational achievement, and it's generally needed for matriculation purposes, not for all universities, but for education achievement. And I would say to be an educated Irish person means that you know Irish, and that has significant value. And there is so much written about Irish language policy and planning. I'm just giving a very small flavour of it here. There is a huge amount. So the first thing I said, there was alignment, influence, expertise, and can't remember the last one. Anyway, I'll come to them. And these are the things that influence how a thread like this develops, and how and they have to do with the technology. So the alignment is the extent to which the linguistic ideology is expressed, align with other content, or the language behavior aligns with other content, your profile, your biography. Now, this is about your coherence with your Twitter identity or your online identity, your narrative and your behavior. And the image is really the message here. It doesn't matter if you're a dog or not a dog. It matters if you're a dog online, you know, or if you're not a dog online, or if people don't realize what you are. So basically, the identifiability is important. The coherence between the offline and the online is important for some people, but for a lot of people it isn't. And our techno-social lives are you know, really important for us. So this online offline thing, you know, are they really like that offline? Does it really matter? So it's whether you are whether what you're saying, how you're behaving aligns with your online identity. And I'll just give you two examples here. I need to explain them, but for instance, this quote here, in terms of the mom discussion, this person is saying, as far as I can see, it's the people who said mum that now say mom. So mum would be seen as a British thing, an English thing, not good in an Irish context. Mam still remains. So this is the very typically Irish way of saying it. And then, so this is someone discussing it. And then this person comes in and said, obviously their colonial guilt is kicking in. So I look into this person to see how this aligns with them. And they're posting about things like a commemoration for the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland, a commemoration for the Solo Head Beg massacre, which was a really brutal event within the Irish War of Independence. So they obviously have a strong Republican nationalist kind of identity online, and this aligns with them saying, oh, you know, people who aren't really Irish say mum. You know, if they were really Irish, they would say mum. Again, this person was talking about, you know, it comes from Irish and that, and their Twitter profile, even I think having an Irish name can give you expertise. So having your name in a certain language, having a geographical location can claim expertise. And you know, they're talking about all their activities. They're a podcaster, columnist, they run the Irish Bar, etc. So there's a strong alignment between what people are saying and, you know, their online identity. Validation then. So this is like, well, you know, you can say anything. I think we were talking about this in the session earlier, but nobody needs to listen and nobody needs to share it. So this is about the media richness we get from Twitter or an online event where we get immediate feedback, and our tweet takes off or our post takes off. So it's about validation from like-minded people. There's a kind of a synthetic personal interaction. People might tag the person, visual and other cues. So it really depends on who validates you. And in these examples here, on the left-hand side, the person is being validated by the original poster and gets a certain number of likes, quite a few likes, 45 and 30, and you know, it's all a very nice, cozy conversation, and they get validated. This person on the right comes in and says, never said mum or mam in our lives. Belfast, they're in Belfast in Northern Ireland. It's ma and da, pronounced ma and da. And then someone comes in to bring them back on track. There's a lot of policing here. I'm talking about people who said mum. And then he comes back in and says, just letting you know, okie dokie. And, you know, so, and then his tweet dies. So it took me a long time to find this tweet because it hadn't been validated, whereas this tweet was up. So this validation is important. Display of specialist knowledge, relevant education and professional activity, can be explicit or can be implicit, can be about where you are. And this can be positive or negative. So sometimes in today's world, expertise is actually a negative, professional expertise. So just to give you an example here, when I did a TEFL course in Dublin years ago, we looked at how the UK lexicon was replaced by the US, mirroring the rise of American influence and the fall of British. Is the mom mystery as simple as that? So I did a TEFL course now. And then this person, it's like a kind of shibboleth. How you say it says everything about your background, class, education, etc. Personally, I say ma'am, and my other half says ma. But you know, oh my gosh, shibboleths, you know, TEFL courses. So you're displaying a certain amount of expertise here. But expertise can be, I come from Belfast, and this is what we say, you know, or I'm working class, or I'm from the west of Ireland, I'm an Irish native speaker. But having an Irish language name can also give you expertise. And then influence, I won't go into this because it's very detailed, but it's, again, I developed this from cyber criminology and CMDA, all sorts of stuff about, you know, likes to retweets, whether you're producing more content or you're just liking things. And there's a lot of work in that, and we can learn a lot from, as I said, from different disciplines. And the original person who, this is a profile of their influence. If you have more than 700 followers, you have influence. So this is what X considers to be having a good following. And another person then just had, so this person had 16,000, this person had 983. So if they like something, validate something, it has a big impact. So I couldn't just treat this as a discussion anymore, or treat this as bits of language. I have to figure out this, and it helped me a lot to figure out how to treat it. So finally, okay, we're doing all of the, we're looking at how these platforms work, how they're managing us, what the effects are. But the last piece of the puzzle, I suppose, and it's an ongoing puzzle, is that we need to think about ourselves in all of this. So we all have an algorithmic identity, as Jan Blomert called it. We all have an algorithmic footprint. And we need to integrate algorithmic reflexivity into our practices. So how do we work with and around our own algorithmic identities? So, you know, this thing knows a lot about us. And so when we go online, that isn't, you know, I don't know anyone who has a separate online, offline, professional and personal identity. Maybe some people are very careful. I don't think we are. It knows already about us and our language behaviors and our interests. So we need to ask, what speech communities and sociolinguistic data do we find or don't we find? More accurately, what finds us, actually? Because this is how it works. It finds us rather than us finding it. Even though we think we're finding it, it's actually finding us. What don't we find and why? What are we gifting and why are we gifting? You know, we may be reflecting on this. This applies to teaching as well. So we're using these spaces for teaching. We're using digitized spaces, and we need to think about that, you know. So, and even spaces that seem to be, we have more and more privatized, isolated spaces like WhatsApp. WhatsApp is still managed. There's still a political technology of WhatsApp. So we need to be reflecting on our Mary Chaco talks about our techno-social lives, but in fact our techno-social professional lives is something we need to think about when we're dealing with data that's come to us through digitization. And I thanks very much to Trina's paper this morning, Trina Quente, the idea of the Habitel, which I think is like this techno-social life, this sort of complete kind of integration. So is this positionality or why not? I don't know, something we can think about. But certainly, you know, I hope I've given you some ideas around how we might move forward, how we might reintegrate a management perspective in dealing with digitization for language policy and language planning. And thank you very much.